Well, good morning if you are in Beverly Hills or Hollywood in Southern California. Good afternoon in New York and places along the eastern part of the United States, North and South America. Hello, Canada. Good evening if you are in Britain, where the king is about to be crowned. Um, Heavy is the head that wears the crown, I gather. Greetings in Europe, in Africa, the Middle East. Special love to our loved ones in Ukraine. We are with you. And greetings to people all around the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know by now, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. My guest today is someone that I met very quickly in January and knew that I had to have him on this program. He's been a very busy man. Raphael Sbarge, I think I pronounced it correctly, S-B-A-R-G-E, not
Yes,
Sbarge.
right.
We will
Right.
find out. Is an actor, a filmmaker who just came out with a new and really wonderful film that I commend to people who follow my program because it addresses issues that we care about. The film is called Only in Theaters. And Raphael, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, Fred. It was you're such a remarkable person, even when I met you shortly, and so I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation with you. Yes. Let me. I'll start the show. That was such a remarkable introduction. So thank you for the introduction, Fred. It sounds like maybe you're dealing with some connectivity issues on your side. My name is Raphael Sbarge. I've been an actor my whole life, and worked in film and television and lots of theater. I grew up in New York City, and my parents were both also in the arts. My mother was a theatrical costume designer, and my dad was a playwright. And I grew up backstage, and so I grew up going to the theater and going to music and going to concerts and really having an opportunity to kind of really enjoy live culture, as it were, is an important thing for me.
So, Raphael, you may not know that I was cut off by the Zoom gremlins again. I imagine that you told our audience about yourself, and now we're going to proceed to the film, and I hope that Zoom will behave. Did you talk at all about your film, or shall we do that right now?
No, I just spoke for a second. I mean, I just
about
please
yourself.
Take it from here. Yeah.
Okay. So the title is Only in Theaters, and I was very affected by this film for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's very well made, which is not a given with filmmaking. It crosses the line between documentary narrative, but also the story of a family and their relationship to the film industry, but their relationship also to survival. Whether it is the fact that the family fled Germany, Stuttgart specifically, after Kristallnacht in 1938, but then dealt with economic adversity in the United States, dealt, in fact, with Thomas Edison and his patents and so on, and ultimately created what I think we would call one of the first theaters and chains of theaters that presents cinema. And I'm not a snob at all. I love the movies and I love cinema. But someone in the movie described the difference between movies, and I should say in your film, describe the difference between the movies, which are escapism, and cinema, which involves the psyche. In other words, engaging ones in different ways. These were movie theaters in Southern California that presented world cinema and not only the latest thing to come out of Hollywood, although we love a lot of the greatest things that come out of Hollywood. But the point is, a broader world was brought to Los Angeles with the Laemmle Cinemas, which were the name of the family, and with them, filmmakers who were not known. For example, Ingmar Bergman was presented as in the Laemmle family. Talk about the Laemmle family and their cinemas at their heyday.
Right. So, well, there's two parts of this, right? There's the part about Carl Laemmle. Carl Laemmle was the immigrant German Jew who came from Stuttgart, as you mentioned, and he tried to work as a machinist, but because he was a Jew, he was unable to work, and was therefore working at a dry goods business. So the story goes, and one day he was there at his place of business, and he saw people lining up, leaving money behind and taking nothing with them, and the business across the street. And what was it? It was a Nickelodeon, was the first theater. And so he thought, that's swell, I want to do that. And so this is a fellow who literally saved pennies and got enough pennies to be able to get a movie theater that is a Nickelodeon, and it did very well, and then had more. And he then wanted to make his own movie. And in the course of doing that, what happened was he bumped up, as you referenced, against the Edison Trust. Edison, if you think of Apple, someone who's interested in the patents, as it were, a big monolith organization that really was not interested in the art, but really interested in the control of the tech, as it were. And so this 4.5-foot, pugnacious German Jew said, that's ridiculous. Filmmaking began in Europe. He can't own movies. And so he went all the way to the Supreme Court and won. And as a result of this, Laemmle essentially doing that, we have independent cinema today. Literally, that is what created it. He then went to California, bought some farmland, opened a movie studio, and created Universal Pictures, of which he did 800 movies, including Phantom of the Opera, Hunchback of Notre Dame, and on and on and on. He met, discovered people like Valentino Mernaloy and a young illustrator named Walt Disney, etc. Remarkable man, and also kind of a Schindler of sorts. He had this sort of passion for his homeland. So he really, because he was a millionaire, he was able to sponsor people from his homeland and bring them over and say they were his cousins. He brought 350 people, saved them, before World War II, notably William Wyler, who was actually a cousin of the Laemmle, arguably one of the greatest film directors ever. For actors, his films got more Oscars for its actors than any other film. But he also brought two other cousins, and this was the branch of this was Max and Kurt Laemmle, who then came to America, worked at Universal as he did. You would come and you'd work at the studio to help pay off your travel costs, et cetera. And then they bought a local movie theater and then essentially expanded that. With the advent of television, where the movie industry collapsed, what happened then was that one of the brothers sort of moved off, and Max stayed with this, what was 6 or 7 movies went down to 1 because people weren't going anymore. And
movie theaters,
exactly. They were staying home and watching the box in their living room. He was the one that had the vision.
Let's not get ahead on that. I want to stick with that a little more.
Yeah.
Don't apologize. Los Angeles, I'm a New Yorker. You're a New Yorker, actually. Is a city that was built in a way on a few things. One of them was energy. People forget that. And land. There was a lot of oil in Southern California. Also land and real estate and speculation. Some agriculture and water, primarily, was always a precious commodity for people who had it or did not. And ultimately, the movies, or as it's often called, the industry. And people who worked in the industry came to Southern California, aspired to be in the movies. The movies created drama, comedy, imagery, silent film first, which was really more originally from New Jersey and New York City, and then migrated west, and then sound pictures, as they were called. And during the Depression, when people were poor, cinema offered fantasy, it offered a release, it offered a way to dream, and was crucial in the American imagery because at that point in time, there was the theater, there was opera, concerts, and there was radio. And I want to just put this out there and we can get back to it later. When I teach opera, I often refer to opera as the progenitor of cinema, that movies are the direct outgrowth of opera and not the theater, not other things. And the reason is that you have big imagery, you have big emotions in film, you have big emotions in opera. The only difference really being, well, there are a couple. One is that opera is live, but also opera, the primary communication medium is music, whereas in cinema, the primary communication is words and language. Both have very important visuals, and many of the early films were actually drawn from operatic stories.
Ah,
And the literature, for example, Camille with Greta Garbo is La Traviata. And there are many, many, many early films because the stories in early cinema often came out of theater, out of novels, out of opera.
that's fabulous. I didn't know that
With the
correlation.
stories, yeah, Strata from the 1950s was really a retelling of Cavalli Rusticana. I'm sorry, of
Ah,
Pagliacci, the story of the traveling circus and a woman who is beaten down by the man who travels with her. It's very direct. And so much of cinema really is the daughter of opera. And I commend that to people when they think about movies and cinema, that it came before an opera. Cinema is to the 20th century what opera was to the 19th.
ah,
So,
that's a great metaphor.
and then came World War II, and cinema went to war, so to speak, and was an image maker. I'm talking about American cinema. Actors from Europe and elsewhere who were in Los Angeles or New York basically stayed. Many of the actors, American not only, and directors went to war. William Wyler, for example, who you mentioned, went to war and was badly injured in the war and never quite recovered emotionally, physically. He lost much of his hearing. He made documentaries in the theaters of war. And for many of the foreign-born artists who were in LA or New York, it was a means of expressing their patriotism, especially German and Austrian-born artists such as William Wyler and Billy Wilder became important figures in cinema in the United States. Marlene Dietrich, the most famous, because she basically declared herself against the Nazis and entertained the American and the British troops. And I mention this because all the people who went to war and all the emigres who came to America, we in America after World War II to know more about these cultures through foreign films, foreign for Americans, so that suddenly French films arrived a lot more, Italian films, German, Japanese, even nations that had fought against the Allies in World War II. We began to know them in different ways through their movies.
Hmm.
And German cinema, Japanese cinema in particular, uh, these films by Kurosawa and others came to the United States, they came to what we call independent cinemas in Los Angeles and New York City. When you were growing up in New York, did you go to independent cinema?
Yeah, I went to, I mean, I grew up in the Upper West Side. I lived on the Lower East Side, but, the Thalia, of course, the New Yorker, and then Lincoln Plaza, which is so ridiculous and tragic that it sits there empty after 5 years. It's just sort of sitting there. And of course,
so the sound broke up. I heard you grew up on the Upper West Side.
Yeah, the Upper West Side and the Lower East Side, and then
so we're having sound issues.
Yeah, how do I help you with how do we get back on the rails?
Well, I think maybe I'll fill in now, and if you hear me nod or raise your hand, I was going to say that the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where Lincoln Center is, north of there, when we were boys, and before that, had a whole string of independent cinemas on Broadway, basically starting at the Cinema Studio at 66th Street, and then the Regency on 67th Street, which played Buñuel's Belle de Jour for a year, all the way up Broadway to nearly Columbia University, was filled with independent cinemas. And then after that came along something which I think you mentioned called Lincoln Plaza Cinema.
I'm Fred, you appear to have frozen, but I'm gonna keep talking to say, yeah, there was a Lincoln Plaza Cinema, and I know that there.
Hi, now you talk now. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. I mean, there were a lot of cinemas on the Upper West Side and throughout the city, and there was a culture of film, and the Thalia was a great magical place to go, and I. New York still probably is a center for film going. I think there's still wonderful places, the IFC and the Film Forum, and obviously Lincoln Center. But the fact is that there were a lot more cinemas at one time, and they have. There's a lot less. There's even one that just closed just even a month or so ago, the Cinepolis, which is in Chelsea, with a huge theater, such an important theater. So there are far less theaters than there were.
Yeah.
And so we are the film was made really in direct, at least initially, it was made in direct response to what is this incredible legacy story, which is a story I told you about Carl Laemmle and this family's journey to this immigrant family business.
So again,
Go ahead, Fred. Did you want to take it? So basically what happened then was that the business started, at least the film started with this legacy story, this family business, and this amazing, family there's been a Laemmle in the movie business since there's been a movie business. There's been, this influence of this family has been far and deep and wide in terms of kind of what they have, what they've done, who they've influenced, and what they've accomplished. They've got the French Legion of Honor for what they did for French, for the French New Wave, and they've supported the Australian New Wave, and there were many, many, many filmmakers who really sort of dedicated, or really marked them as being both an inspiration and or sort of a place where their films were elevated and their careers were, really based upon what the Laemmles had done. I had no idea the depth and the breadth of the legacy, but what I did find was as we started this, that there was a sort of a wonderful family business story, and that is kind of what I followed. And over 24 months, we shot it for 2.5 years, essentially, arguably the most tumultuous time in their 85-year history. It became kind of a microcosm of the macrocosm, because while it is in Los Angeles and while it is a very specific cinema chain that maybe many of your listeners don't know, maybe they've never been to Los Angeles, maybe they don't even like Los Angeles, but dollars to donuts, there's another there's a theater in your town, wherever you are, that is likely suffering some kind of similar downward pressure. And the popular thing now is to say it's streaming, but it's not just streaming. It's a combination of so many things, which includes social media and the lack of critics, the lack of staffing on newspapers to actually review movies, and also people's attention spans, and then, because of the pandemic, people just getting out of the habit of going to the movies. It's a very specific experience, movie going, and thus the title, only in theaters, right? It is again, it's where the magic happens. It's where that transcendence happens when you're sitting in a theater. You come in, whether this be for a concert or whether it be for a movie, I believe, but you come in as strangers, you leave as friends because you have this shared experience, and you're all transported through what happens on the air. Go ahead, Fred.
Because my internet connection is unstable, I'm just going to ask a question that maybe you addressed.
Yeah.
What led to the decline. I also want to say that your film, which maybe you said this, covers the period when you first saw them in 2019, when it was about, can they survive just purely financially, and then the pandemic that hit and closed theaters all around the United States. And Greg Lemley, one of the characters, well, not characters, one of the protagonists of the film, mused aloud, why is it possible for people to go eat in restaurants in Los Angeles but not sit in movie theaters in Los Angeles? My concern regarding cinema, but also regarding opera and theater, although theater in New York is beginning to bounce back, is that, as you described it, the falling out of the habit. There's the social situation of going with someone or on your own to a film, to a play, to an opera, and enjoying it collectively and feeling the intake of breath at a certain moment, whether it's a great moment on the screen or whether it's the way someone is singing or acting. I this week have gone to a few small independent cinemas in New York, the Quad, the Cinema Village, because I like to patronize these places. I've been to several plays and musicals and operas this week. It's a period in New York now that's flourishing in terms of what's on offer. And I find that, for example, I went to see a film at the Cinema Village the other day, and there were precisely two people in the audience. It's a small theater, but there literally were two people, myself and a woman who sat across the aisle. And we spoke about the film after, because I think we felt the need just to discuss the film with the only other person who shared that experience. During the pandemic, when people could not go out, the Metropolitan Opera and many opera companies offered daily streams of operas. And I know many people were very grateful for that. I barely watched them for years. I could not focus on a small screen. I could not receive the sound that is nothing like the glorious sound of the human voice and musical instruments without amplification in the beautiful acoustic of the Metropolitan Opera House. And so I did not partake of that, but I know that there are many people who did, and it was hard to get them back to the opera house. And then in the case of opera, there is live HD in cinemas in which the operas are shown on screens around the world, live from the Met, where people pay $25 or $30, and they get a version of what's happening on the stage, but they're not getting the live opera-going theatrical experience. I can't give that up, and I think maybe it's my age and my tradition that I love the live communal experience. And I don't read a book surrounded by hundreds of people, but I do attend performances in which we collectively breathe and receive and perhaps after discuss. And to me, there's one of the films by Woody Allen, I forget which, probably Annie Hall, in which he and Annie Hall are lined up to see a film at the New Yorker on 88th Street and Broadway. And some loudmouth starts bloviating about what Marshall McLuhan would say, and Woody Allen, who plays sort of a nerdy Upper West Side intellectual, says, no, that's not what he would say. And here's Marshall McLuhan to tell you what he would say. There was this active discussion that one has. The only place in the world that I really know where this still exists, apart from when you go to film festivals, is in Paris, where Paris has many small cinemas, and they'll do specially curated series that might be Iranian films of the 1940s or the complete works of Henry Fonda, things that are important, but most people don't necessarily do them. And I quote those two because in Paris, I saw Iranian films of the 1940s and I saw the complete works of Henry Fonda. Amazing. There it's known as the seventh art. Cinema is the seventh art form. And it is revered in France in ways that it's not necessarily in other places outside of universities and the fringe. In Paris, it remains quite central. But that's, God bless the French for that. They're always on strike and demonstrating, but when they get their act together, they do wonderful things in the arts.
I'd say
what I also wanted to ask you about is how, number one, how did you actually make this film, given, number one, that independent filmmakers have to raise money, number two, the adversity of filming people were having terrible times in their lives, first when their family business was in effect crumbling, but their family legacy. That's what struck me so much. It's as if Greg Lemley had the burden on his shoulder of ending what was a family legacy. And the family legacy represented not only a business, but immigration, Judaism. In this particular case, you begin the film with a Friday night Shabbos Sabbath dinner and introduce their religiosity, but I would call it, I'm guessing, a liberal Jewish religiosity based on humane values, especially the wife Tish. And they become protagonists in the story. And all of this happened before the pandemic. I think you would have had a gripping story even if the pandemic had not happened.
Yes, no, that's right.
Do you think about how the story would have been different had the pandemic not come?
So I was on a panel with Ira Deutschman, who's a wonderful film person, and he teaches film at Columbia and was a distributor, et cetera. He's a very knowledgeable person, and he was talking about documentaries, and he said, there's two kinds of documentaries. There's the kind of documentary where you know what you're going to shoot, you have it all basically dialed in, and you go out and you shoot that and you deliver that. There's the other kind, which is far riskier, which is the one that I did, which was this kind of a sense of kind of following the story. And the only way this could have been told is if we had done it for the 2.5 years that we did. Now, I thought at any number of times that this was done, that was over, that we had finished it, or I would think to myself, when is this going to be over? Because it just kept moving, the ball kept bouncing. But there is some point where, and I've heard this now from other filmmakers, you come up with an idea, you come up with a thesis, you start there and you begin in earnest in that direction. But what happens then is at some point the film lets you know what film it's going to be. It actually tells you, and you have an opportunity at that moment either to get on that boat or not. And if you don't, you will get the film that you wanted. But in this case, we just kept following. And again, because of Greg Lemley's graciousness and his openness to this, and Greg Lemley obviously knows documentary film. He's programmed many, and understands kind of what makes a great film is this sort of sense of commitment and honesty and just leaning in. I mean, he was really there for us all the way through the process. And I kept asking him, "Is it okay? Can we keep following you?" And we had to sign NDAs because at some point we were in rooms, but we had information that was, wouldn't have been appropriate for us to, disseminate, and we were fine about that. But what happened was, he gave us full access to what was this process. And yeah, I mean, I it's very, very difficult to make a movie. It's very, very difficult to keep your crew, engaged. It's very, very difficult to keep going. It's difficult to keep raising the money. There's all sorts of unforeseen expenses that come along. I've never done anything at this scale before. Films I'd done previously have been with networks or sort of independent that then have sort of done festival routes and stuff like that. This is, a full-fledged feature. And obviously, I'm out there. I mean, we've had a theatrical run. We've played 80, 90 cities. I wanted it
I'm going to get to that in a moment about the cities.
Yeah, that's
I'll
fine.
get to that in a moment.
But what I discovered was that it was a lot of piecing it together. To answer your question, how did you do this? I mean, I initially put some of my own money into it. Then I found some investors who put some money into it. Then there were more expenses, and because it kept going, I had to sort of end up putting a bunch more of my money into it. So it's sort of some combination of a hybrid. Finally, there's deferments. So the filmmakers who were involved, remarkable filmmakers, Rick Prack was the editor, and Thomas Cassetta was the producer and the sound mixer, and Matt Kubis, who was the DP, the camera person, donated enormous amounts of time because they believed in the story, because they thought it was important, because we were talking about something that was really about, yes, it's about family, and yes, it's about resilience, but it's also about the future of cinema. So then the question is, how do we keep going? Because we kept being in the room, literally, as they say, in the room where it happened. We were there many times when that pivot happened, and we were all sort of entranced by that. And then people continued to want to talk to us. People like Cameron Crowe, who I understand never does interviews. He's just not available for them. Ava DuVernay, difficult to reach, but she did speak to us because of how Greg Lemley had helped her as a young filmmaker. James Ivory, Allison Anders, Nicole Holofcener. These are all Oscar winners, nominees, or prolific filmmakers, and they spoke to directly how meaningful this theater was, or the theater experience was, and how important it was to them that their films be shown. James Ivory talked at great length about how Merchant, his partner, when they were, because he would really be the one selling the movies and kind of really getting them out, that is Merchant, that Merchant was always very excited when they got the Laemmle Theater, because he knew that was a direct line to his audience and how important that was. And again, I want to just sort of underline this, which is that, yes, it's about this specific art house cinema in Los Angeles. There are some reasons why it is important, because it is a transmission point for so much of what we know about film, and because they've been there for so long. However, it is at the end of the day really about, we ask larger questions about theaters and about where we're headed. And so it was a sort of a diving board for a larger conversation. And that was the opportunity that happened as we were filming. Again, the whole zeitgeist of kind of like, what's going on? There was this sort of day and date thing that happened where they were opening movies online as well as in the theaters, which was devastating. There was, more and more discussions about how movie theaters are dead. There were, the ArcLight in Los Angeles closed. There were more theaters closed. And so there was all of this stuff happening every day. There were headlines. And here we were literally traveling with this family day to day, really sort of watching the cost beyond the headlines, watching a family struggle with this, and arguably theater royalty. I mean, Truffaut and Ingmar Bergman and Agnes Varda all came to lunch at their house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're so humble and unaffected, un-Hollywood in that regard. There's nothing showy about them. They're a sweet Jewish family who care deeply about the art of film, filmmaking, filmmakers, and the audiences who love them. And that level of caring, the caring that one family would extend by virtue of it being a family business, is so beautiful, was beautiful to me, right? In a world that's more corporate, that's more, here we are now in the middle of the writer's strike, right? Or the beginning of the writer's strike, which could go on very long, but you've got, 11,000 writers against 6 giant conglomerates, basically, David and Goliath story again. And this is a family where if you call the Laemmle Theaters, as I did, I got Greg Lemley on the phone. I mean, when it's a man above the title, and you know that's a remarkable thing for artists. It's very, very hard to make a movie, but once you make it, to actually then have a theater who's receptive to that, that's just huge.
I heard almost everything you said, thankfully, but one thing I missed was someone who teaches at Columbia University. Was that Richard Pena?
Ira Deutschman.
Okay.
Yeah.
I asked because Richard Pena used to be head of the New York Film Festival, and he now teaches film at Columbia. I went to Columbia's journalism school, and we studied documentaries there as well. And what you were saying about following the story, journalists are always taught, do not have the story written in your head and then see confirmation of what you've written, but do as much research as you can and then just see what actually happens.
Right.
And you have to cover that rather than the story that you think you want to tell.
That's exactly right.
That's called fiction. You, when the film came out, toured the film, and it played in many cinemas around the country. And I know that you went to many of them. You were supposed to be on with me a while back, but you had to go to San Francisco. And talk about the experience, number one, just as the pandemic was winding down, but number two, of showing your film to live audiences, seeing audience reactions, and then perhaps speaking with audiences after. How did a film about movie theaters play it live in movie theaters from the filmmaker's point of view?
You know, I've yet to be in an audience who hasn't been just sort of deeply moved. You know, Kenneth Turan said the movie is heartbreaking and heartening. You know, there's something about. There are many people who came out and saw it and said it's their first movie that they've come to, and there's something about. Oh, there was a sweet thing that happened where this woman who's an investor in the movie, Carol Chandler, brought her 9-year-old grandson, and he said, "Oh, Grandma, I don't ever want to go to any other theaters other than Lumley Theaters," you know. So that there's you can't not fall in love with them. That is the family, but because they're just so lovely. But I heard over and over again at these Q&As that I did all over the country, where people said, you know, we need to go to the theaters more. This is such a wonderful reminder. You know, and how important it is. And from filmmakers, you know, like I guess, you know, the question, you jump to the end and you ask the question, what happens when they're gone, right? If they're gone, what happens when movie theaters are, you know, just all condos? What do we lose? And you know, it is a precious art form, as you say. I love that the French consider it the seventh. What did you say? The seventh
art. Yeah,
lovely. And that's right. And certainly, I love what you said also in your intro, that it was a dynamic, that what opera was in the 19th century, that's what film was in the 20th century. That's just wonderful. And I believe, you know, we have to remember that these movie theaters are about a movie experience. You know, I think about how we sit and stream. I mean, look, streaming is not going away. Streaming is a wonderful part of our life. And it's obviously been sort of a wonderful conduit for us, you know, through the pandemic when we couldn't go out. However, you know, I think about how people sit and they, you know, you think about the food reference. I mean, it's like they get it and they shove it in their mouth or in their head, right? And they binge it, right? They watch, you know, 14 episodes or something. They at that point, you're just kind of like, there's a voracious hunger to kind of just what's next. There's a sort of an impatience in that. Like, I need more. There's not literally the experience, the champagne bubble of having the movie. And that's what movie theaters provide. The fact that I'm become sort of a passionate advocate for this. I mean, I made a movie that ultimately ended up having a cause at the end of it, which then coincides obviously to live music and concerts and certainly opera. As I've heard, of course, live venues also struggling with how do we get people to come back? How do we remind people how important this is? What happens when it's gone? And so, what you do and the people that you reach and the opportunity to kind of have these conversations, hopefully is a wonderful reminder to everyone that we keep these art forms alive by our presence. Technology has allowed us to create the fantasy of well, fantasy of connectedness while being completely alone, right? So we're social animals. And I think these also, it's important for us to be able to continue to sort of find places to gather.
I do not give away spoilers on films because I really want people to discover them for themselves. And I'm not going to do that with your film, with one little exception, just because I found it so gripping that I'll address it in the most indirect way. When the Lemley family were facing, number one, the whammy of declining audiences, and number two, the pandemic that led them to shut down because they had to shut down like all theaters, they moved away from Los Angeles. I won't say to where, but they moved to a place that is a lovely city, but the climate, the whole spirit of that place is very different from Los Angeles. And to see them locked there, it is a lovely place. I'm not knocking the city. I've been to that city. There's a great opera company there, but it's just so different. And they seem so rooted in Los Angeles and their sense of self and their sense of mission. That to me was very shocking and upsetting. Maybe I missed it, but what led to that decision? Was it finances, or to get psychically away from what was so upsetting to them?
Remember when that was happening, when everyone was basically escaping cities, right? When people were running to the country and buying houses sight unseen, and property values were up 30%, everyone's migrated back now, right? Because we all realize, we want to be in cities, we want to be around other people. But this was a form of remote work. I know that his sister lives there, and I think his son was living there. One of his sons. I believe also that Tish was concerned for his health and his well-being. So I think getting away also was I think important, just that he would be for his health and safety, I think, in some senses. But I can say is that they are back in Los Angeles often. He continues to he comes and stays at his dad's, which is great. He's still programs his theater. He's got everyone in place where the movie theaters are still up and running and thriving. At this point, I think, the irony of movie theaters at the moment is that we've had some of the highest grossing movies of all times in the past 2 years, right? Including, as of a couple of weeks ago, Super Mario Brothers. I haven't seen it. I probably won't, but this was one of the, it's a big movie and it helps theaters. Top Gun, Avatar, all of these, Spider-Man, these are all big tent movies, right? These are tentpole movies. They have a big popular audience, and people have been coming out in crazy droves. They've also reversed the day and date thing with the studios, which is fantastic news, again, for theater owners. The issue. What do
you mean by day and date? What is day and date?
Day and date was where this happened over the pandemic, where they would have a movie and they would release it in theaters, and they would then also release it online at the same time. Okay. And what happened was, movies that would have, gathered more box office essentially were left, suddenly plummeted because people were just watching them at home, and the studios thought that was a solution. Well, that everyone has basically sort of pivoted away from that, except Netflix. But the fact is that there is, I think, a sense of kind of optimism for movie theaters as far as big movies. The question really is the smaller movies, the movies that don't have superheroes in them, and that really are sort of about sort of deeper, maybe adult fare. Let's just say adult fare that really speaks to our heart and our psyche, as Bruce Rubin said. These are the places that really provide that, and how do we support that?
Do you believe that in our very wealthy country, where we also have a lot of disproportionate wealth concentrated in certain places, and millions of poor people who suffer and don't have health care and everything that we have, countries with a lot less resources than ours support cinema? One of the independent films I went to the other day was called The Quiet Girl. It's an Irish film
Oh,
that was
yeah.
nominated for Best Non-American Film. I think it's not called foreign film anymore for the Oscars. And it was a beautiful film. Some of it was in Gaelic, the rest was in English with an Irish accent. And it was supported by the Irish Film Board. And there are funds in these countries, including Ireland, which only has 4 million people, to support cinema, to support broadcasting, support all of the arts, on the theory that number one, it creates work, but number two, that it preserves and expresses a diversity in the culture. So this was about a little girl who was very shy and got sent away from where she lived in destitute poverty to live with a slightly better off family member, and how she grew and changed. And then how, when that summer came to an end, she had to go back to where she was from. It was a very beautiful film.
Mm.
And Ireland looked gorgeous, even in the impoverished parts. Seeing people interacting, talking with one another, the silences, agriculture, weather, all of these things that are documented in the daily life of this girl and her extended family, was supported in part, only in part, by the Irish Film Board. Canada has it, many nations have it. And I I certainly believe in it for music, opera, theater, dance, all of the arts, literature. But I think that America needs to have support for, let's call it, independent cinema. Now, there are wealthy filmmakers such as Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg who do a lot, and I'm grateful to them for doing it, but we should not have to rely on them, I think, to do that. What's your feeling about America supporting cinema as an art form?
Oh gosh, I mean, we played in Ireland. We played in Galway, and with Odeon Theaters, and I was again very moved by the response to the film, and heard a lot about this you know what the support that they get as artists. We as a country honestly suck in terms of our recognition of artists. I mean, artists do lead the culture in terms of ideas and in terms of sort of finding both words and emotions and sound for what is welling within us. We are all turn to, whether it be a movie or a song or a moment in a painting or a sculpture that really captures something that really touches our heart and really sort of gives form to what is inside us. And artists do that. Artists bring so much color and depth and dimension. And yet, of course, we are, more often than not, marginalized or sort of, the last thing we think of. I mean, and I can say also, I mean, clearly we live in a time when it's harder and harder to get funding for things that matter. But I don't want to get too broad in my response, but just to say, yes, there has to be recognition that as France has it, that is one of the seven arts. That would just in of itself be wonderful. There was, for what it's worth, and the reason why many theaters and many other venues actually are still there is because of what's called a shuttered venue grant. This did come through during the pandemic, and it was essentially a government-funded program to keep these live venues afloat. And thank goodness that happened. I am I'm grateful for that, and yet, there's still more can be done. I mean, again, Ira Deutschman, I was writing about the fact that there are very few movie theaters on the Upper West Side to show movies now, and he's looking for a space such that one could actually show it. You and I met at the new Plaza Cinema, which is a lovely cinema. Just so beautifully placed, but it's small, and it doesn't necessarily have the scope. They only are able to program on the weekends, and there's a wider audience than there is actual space to for them to come to, and that's the challenge. That's the challenge.
I don't know, when I was cut off by the internet, whether you spoke in detail about the genesis of the new Plaza Cinema. Did you?
No.
then I will. Um, I know you mentioned Lincoln Plaza Cinemas, which was owned and run by the Talbot family, and there were 6 screens, and it was opposite Lincoln Center, the Metropolitan Opera, and then the New York Philharmonic, and it created really a cultural district. And they also had very loyal, lovely staff who part of the pleasure of going there was seeing these lovely people who worked there. And the lobby had paintings of members of the staff. That's how revered they were.
Wow.
And they were from places such as Ethiopia and Sudan, and were given jobs as immigrants when they couldn't find jobs elsewhere. And they were so loyal to the family and took such good care of them. And they, in New York, the Talbots, were really the ones at a certain point who were the leaders in terms of determining what films got shown. They often came from film festivals in Europe, but also these independent works and independent American works. And I went 3 times a week
Wow.
for many, many years. And on their very last day, I made a point of going to the last screening of the last film,
Oh,
which
wow.
started Annette Bening, and I got the last piece of orange cake that they had. They had 5 big screens, and screen number 4 was the small one, and the small one was always, you really had esoteric films in that one. And in its heyday, people would line up for hours, and often it would get the New York premiere of films, or something that premiered across the street at Lincoln Center at the New York Film Festival would get its commercial run at Lincoln Plaza. So when Lincoln Plaza folded, frankly, because of rapacious real estate, the people who owned the building just decided that they were not making enough money on the Talbots. And then Mr. Talbot died very soon thereafter. And the people who were audience members were so outraged at the behavior and what it represented culturally for New York, because it's still dark, this space, years later. Nothing has ever gone in there in its place. Some of them got together and created the new Plaza Cinema, and they were sort of gypsy-like, and they would find screens at universities and present films, and they're very scrappy and they're very entrepreneurial. It's not about the money, it's about preservation of film, and that's where I met you. And but it's a shame that we have to be like that. I heard you also talking about the Thalia. The Thalia, when I was a kid, I don't know if you went there much as a kid, but unfortunately, the Thalia, great films though they showed, was sort of the hangout for perverts and sex people who were looking for stuff. And I, as a 12-year-old boy, just did not want to be in that place. And it was a shame because I, got much of my Kurosawa and Bergman and so on at the Thalia, but I had to go strategically when I knew that it would be a little safer to go. But now it's been cleaned up, and Leonard Nimoy, the actor, funded its restoration, and now the Thalia is a lovely place to go. But we have very little, and it's just horrifying to me that we don't. I mean, in Paris, they have a hall of cinema that is where you go and all the films are shown, and there's a National Archive, and you can see all these different films. It's called a Cinematheque, really. And in New York and Los Angeles and London, there are cinematheques, in Berlin, but they're more specialized. Whereas in Paris, it was really about the openness to the art form. Rome to a certain degree, but Rome is different. Rome is wonderful, but different for that. But I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. In doing my research, I discovered that you and I have a person in common that maybe we should talk about. His name is Austin Pendleton.
Oh, yeah. I love Austin so much.
Would you talk about Austin Pendleton, who's a classic New York figure?
Yeah.
And then I'll tell you how I know him.
Everyone's got an Austin Pendleton story. He's such an amazing character. And he actually went to college with my parents. So I've literally known him since I was in the womb, as it were. I have Did a movie in my early 20, I guess at 20 years old, where I met him. He was in the film and we became friends. I've studied with him, and he wrote a play that Frank Langella was called Booth, that I was in with Frank Langella, Williamstown, and then also at Long Wharf, and we've just been dear friends, and have been for many, 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 many years, like 40 years. So I'm crazy about him just because of the fact that he's such an astounding artist. He was my teacher. He's directed me. He's a remarkable guy, and he's now 80 something, and he literally works more than anyone that I know. Constantly, he just directed a play on Broadway that did very well. Stephen Adly Girgis play that was transferred from an earlier production that he had done. He's always
from Riverside to Crazy.
Riverside to Crazy, right?
Yeah.
He just was in, did at Steppenwolf, I think, last month, and he's always working and always doing something, and his stories are unbelievable, astounding. The people that he's worked with, and from Orson Welles, Elizabeth Taylor, and on and on and on. So he's a great man and a dear friend.
He's a director. He's an actor. He's an acting teacher. He's a very famous acting teacher. Yeah. The way I know him is that I had a beloved cousin who was an actress named Alice Playton. Her name was Plotkin. She became Alice Playton. And she began in the chorus of the Metropolitan Opera as a child, was in the Met premiere of Vutsek as Marie's Child, then was in the original production of Gypsy with Ethel Merman, then Oliver with Georgia Brown, then Hello Dolly with Carol Channing were her first 3 shows. And then at that point, she and Austin were in a play together as very young people. And I'm suddenly forgetting the name of it, but they were the 2 stars. The Last Sweet Days of Isaac, it was called.
Yes.
And they both became well-known. Alice was well-known already in the theater community. He then did Muttle the Tailor in Fiddler on the Roof. And then Arthur Miller wrote a play for Alice Playton and Austin Pendleton called Up from Paradise, in which they played Adam and Eve. And Len Cariou played the devil. So I don't know if your friend Austin ever told you that Arthur Miller wrote a play for him and for my cousin Alice.
I didn't actually know that. That's really cool.
You can ask him about that. And I mention him because he is one of the many artistic figures that one finds in a city such as New York, London, Los Angeles, that are the sinew or the connective tissue that maybe are not as famous as Elizabeth Taylor and so on, but nonetheless in the artistic community are really the points of reference. And I know he did a film with Alice, although I forget the name of it. But when Alice died, I and Alice's husband, Joshua, organized a celebration, let's call it. And Annette Bening was the host. And we did a guest list. And I was the first speaker as a family member. Frank Rich, the critic for the New York Times, was the second. And Austin Pendleton was the third. And we had 14 speakers, playwrights and actors and so on, who had been part of Alice's life, ending with Annette Bening. And you can see this on YouTube. You enter Alice Playton, Playten celebration, and there are 5 parts. And Austin is, I believe, in part 1, me, Frank Rich, and Austin Pendleton.
Sweet.
So there's another figure in your film, only in theaters, that I wanted to ask you about. I guess she's Aunt Alyse, Alyse. What a fascinating figure was she in this film.
Yeah.
Talk about it. She was 103 when we meet her. Last I checked, she's still alive at 106.
Yes. So basically what happened was she, when I first approached Greg about the movie, about possibly doing a movie, he told me about Alyse, who was 103 at the time, and his father was 85, going to work every single day. And I said, Greg, how are they? And he said, they're great. And I said, we got to go. We got to get them on film. We can't wait. This is important. So before I even really had any sort of real sense of kind of where the story was, I got them both interviewed. And Alyse, was married to one of the founders of the theater. Carl Laemmle was at her wedding, and brought a film crew with him and filmed him at her wedding. She was, witness to all of the history, and was so vibrant and so alive and so engaged when I spoke to her. It was such a thrill to be able to kind of talk to her, and she's a force. She's a force of nature, and again, a conduit back to history. The other thing was that a family member had discovered a kind of a case of old film cans by the door, and it turned out to be this incredible film that we were able to salvage, and is in the movie theater, which is them arriving in the New York Harbor in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And then a vacation in Switzerland in 1938, just before everything obviously shut down, and then and then wedding footage. So she's just a wonderful. I mean, we spoke to 4 generations of Laemmles, we certainly covered the gamut.
Now, her accent, I was trying to place her, was sort of either Buffalo, Cleveland, Michigan, Northern Indiana, Southern Wisconsin, Northern Illinois. I couldn't quite place it. Do you know where she was from?
God, she told me, but it's been a little while.
Yeah.
I could guess, but I probably shouldn't. So I'm not entirely sure, but I know you've got a very good ear. But yes, she.
I only ask because I'm very sensitive to accents in a good way, and because as speech becomes more common in not only the United States, Italy is a country I know well, but everywhere, where television and mass media have sort of flattened and standardized speech, to hear accents, I often look to much older people. And hers was so pronounced as being, let's call it a Great Lakes accent, that she couldn't be from anywhere else. And if I suddenly discovered that she was from Texas or California, I'd be very surprised.
I don't think so.
Okay. In the film, someone, maybe it's you, a narrator or a speaker, says, imagination is the most significant antidote to the destruction of the human spirit.
Yeah.
And that was very beautiful. Did you say that, or did someone else say that?
No. So that's Mark Ulano. Mark Ulano is another Oscar winner, who is basically Tarantino's sound mixer. He won the Oscar for the Titanic. He's also a documentary filmmaker, and I think it was almost like a 2-hour interview with him. He's an astounding man of great sort of copious knowledge of history and history of film and the details surrounding all the incidents that led. I mean, in a way, it's very similar to you in terms of your breadth of knowledge, and so many different sort of verticals into a conversation. But he spoke about at great length about how important what we do is, and what artists provide, and how important it is to sort of recognize that, and many other things. Too long to actually, unfortunately, include in the movie, but a brilliant mind, and thank you for that, because I think what you heard was a particular favorite of mine as well.
Mine too. Now, another wonderful thing that I loved in the film, a lot of times filmmakers do date stamps when they're documentaries, writing, for example, July 10th, 2019 or whatever. You did the date stamp, but also showed the marquee of one of the Laemmle theaters to show what was playing in that theater on the day of the date. And I noticed that on August 1st of 2019, one of the films playing in the theater you showed was Ron Howard and Jeannie Elfand's documentary about Luciano Pavarotti.
Right, which of course you're a part of. Yeah.
I was one of the advisors on the film. And then when the pandemic came, I guess it was Greg Laemmle had the clever and sad idea of putting putative double features of films that were not on, like Groundhog Day playing today, Groundhog Day playing tomorrow. It was both witty and very sad.
Yeah.
And where did you get the idea to basically always show what was playing on particular moments? It was it was very affecting.
I'm so glad. Thank you. I mean, look, what we learn about this family is that they communicate with a very special language of movies. Which I imagine someone could do with you with opera. If you could talk about, oh, there's that aria where that, that moment that, where that certain thing is being expressed. And if someone to reference that within a conversation, it would open up a whole window of just sort of a understanding beyond language, beyond words. That's what the Laemmle family has in terms of their ability to be able to communicate through movies and through movie scenes. And this is a theme that we have throughout the movie, how the family basically kind of, is able to kind of one up each other with, movie quotes and back and forth banter. And they're fabulously smart and very witty, but it is a theme. When the theaters closed, Greg Laemmle started programming in a way, we were all looking for some way to communicate, but he used the marquees to speak to the moment or the week. And I think he spent a lot of time trying to figure out, what's playing now and what's coming soon. And it was illustrative of what was happening at the time, which of course, as we all know, was just sort of tremendous upheaval. In the very last scene as well in the movie, there's a reference to another movie, which I won't give away. But again, this whole way in which we use movies to communicate a moment, because you can't do it any other way, because you need that movie because it perfectly illustrates what that exact thing is. That's what this family does. And that's what we did with, using these marquees.
You know well that movie theaters used to have what's called the double feature, where you pay an admission and you get to see two films. And often they were second-run films. They were not the Star Wars or whatever, but a film that had been running for a while. And West 42nd Street, in its seediest period, would have double features just to bring people in. And I used to walk down that street during the day because it was not safe for a kid at night. And I would look at the double features, and I invented a game called Double Features, where you put together titles of two films and see how they relate to one another. And I know you're going to play it from now on and teach it to your daughter. But here's a true story from a marquee on West 42nd Street. There was a double feature of two films that you will remember the titles of. The first one was called Throw Mama from the Train. And the second film, which I believe starred one of the Brat Pack, was She's Having a Baby. So on the marquee, it said, Throw Mama from the Train, she's having a baby.
That's great. That's great. That's great. Yeah.
When we met, we spoke briefly about opera because I told you that's part of what I do. And I asked you if there's a particular singer or composer or opera that you like. And you told me that you have a special feeling for the Swedish tenor Jussi Björling. Why is that?
There's something about his voice that feels so pure and beautiful and fluted and sort of almost otherworldly in a way. It feels so, the way sound can affect us on the inside and talk to something in us that you can't express. But there's something about his voice that is just so sweet and pure and beautiful, and unusual. I mean, I found his sound to be unusual. I had a dear friend when I was 16. I did a movie that I starred in called Abuse, and it was a man named Arthur Bresson Jr. And Artie basically befriended me and took me under his wing in terms of like teaching me opera. And I would go to his apartment. He would play wonderful operas. He was an amazing whistler. He could whistle the tenor's aria from Othello and introduce me to Othello. He, Victoria de Los Angeles and Joan Sutherland, and he would just say, "Listen to this," and he would sit and we would listen to it and he would talk about it, and I just would go and just be sort of captured and mystified. He also introduced me to Jussi Björling, and I just something about him just sort of really captured my heart. I also, in a quirky way, for a time I studied opera, and I had a piano teacher. Sorry, I had an opera teacher who was apparent. I've forgotten his name now, but he was on 72nd Street, right by Broadway. And I would have an accompanist, and I would come in, and he apparently was the standby for UC Burling at the Met because UC sometimes had a drinking problem and was unable to attend. So
Yes.
this fellow was the standby for UC, I guess, on those moments. But tell me what you know about UC Burling.
Well, I know a lot about UC Berling. Actually, there is something called the UC Berling Society, and they have monthly meetings. And they were supposed to have a big national meeting in Chicago, but the pandemic put paid to that. But I'm actually going to be lecturing for them online next month. So people may want to look up UC Berling Society, not for my lecture, but in general, because people who care about Berling would want to belong to that society. There's a newsletter, and it's great. My particular relationship to UC Berling, whom I never met, was that my father was a wonderful musician, and he was a trombonist, and he played in all kinds of repertory and loved singing, and raised me on four voices. And you just mentioned two of them. For the soprano, I was raised on Victoria de Los Angeles. For the mezzo soprano, I was raised on Marilyn Horn, who became a very good friend of mine, with whom I worked a lot. For the tenor, I was raised on UC Berling. And for the bass, I was raised on Ezio Pinza. Now, I never asked my father, and I wish I had, why he didn't raise me with a baritone and who the baritone would have been, because my voice, were I to be a singer, is a baritone. And I love a lot of the baritone music in Verdi and Wagner, and not only everywhere, Rossini and Mozart. But he did not raise me in any baritone. So my tenor sound is UC Berling. And my soprano sound is Victoria de Los Angeles, and so forth. And it's not that I don't love all kinds of other tenors. Pavarotti was a close friend, and he was a glorious singer. Alfredo Kraus, magnificent tenor, maybe my favorite if I had to pick one. I don't want to have to pick one. Luciano always said that Kraus was the best tenor. But the point is that we hear the same music as interpreted in the sounds of the voices and how they sing, and it becomes meaningful again. And that's the beauty of live performance. If we go to a play and see A Doll's House, which I recently saw, or Hamlet, each actor who comes into these roles brings his or her voice and body and temperament and charisma and energy, and creates the role anew. And love cinema, though I absolutely do, as you know, the thing about a film is that once it's done, unless there's a so-called director's cut, in which the director recuts it to have the edits the way he or she wants it, it is a thing frozen in time. And in fact, part of what I love about film is that I can look at a film from 1934 or 1967, and they are frozen in that time, and they show imagery and have language and accents of that time. So, for example, if I look at The Graduate from 1967, it's not just about the mores, it's about what car Dustin Hoffman is driving, what drink Anne Bancroft is drinking, the cut of her dress, her makeup, the value systems of the people. And this could be almost any film that's set in a contemporary time, not a history film, for example, not Vanessa Redgrave as Mary Queen of Scots, which is a history film, but Vanessa Redgrave in Blow Up, which is a contemporary film. And I now use cinema as cultural archaeology to go back and look at what a very famous example, Butterfield 8, starring Elizabeth Taylor, for which she won her first Oscar. Not her best film, but it's a very interesting film. And one little detail was the buses that went up and down Fifth Avenue where her character lived were the buses that I knew as a very little boy that we don't see anymore as New York City buses. And another detail was at that time, Fifth Avenue was a two-way street. And so when I tell people how to do research in history, yes, cinema is not always journalism, but there's enough that we can see about what people ate, drank, moved, how they interacted physically with one another. If you see a film where no one kisses, and it's not a romantic film, but a family perhaps does not have any physical contact, that speaks of a certain kind of behavior. The film I saw the other day, the Irish film, The Quiet Girl, until the last moment, no one touched one another.
Mm.
And that was very, very telling. And, you know, one of my policies is the more you look, the more you see. And we revisit good films because we see things that we didn't see before. And that's my way of concluding by saying, I'm going to see your film only in theaters again, because it is a wonderful film in theater. And I gather it is now on Amazon Prime. So you are now a streamer.
Yes, I mean, it's on Amazon. It's not on Prime yet, so it's not international, but it is available on Amazon and on Apple, and it is out there. I mean, we did. It was important for me to do a theatrical run of this movie, particularly. It was it would have felt sacrilegious to have done otherwise, and B. It is, as an independent filmmaker, a way to kind of build awareness for the movie. One of the things that's complicated about independent filmmakers making a film, so you make a film and you get I'm on Netflix, as many of my friends have had films acquired, less so these days. But the issue is, if you're not watching that type of movie in your queue, the algorithm won't serve it to you. So there's no way, unless you go hunting for it, that you'd even sort of bump into it or discover it. It's one of the things that makes movie theaters and or film festivals so important for the future of filmmaking. It is, if the independent voices are the lifeblood of the future, then it's these places, these movie theaters and or film festivals, that program and allow people to discover it. I mean, you and I met at a movie theater when my movie was playing at New Plaza. That's how things can happen. And what occurs, unfortunately, with the sort of flattening of everything, potentially being on streaming, is that if I don't have the marketing budget of Nat Geo or Netflix or Amazon, I'm trying to find ways to connect to an audience. Be able to talk to you and your audience is a wonderful way for me to people say, hey, what is that? And I'm interested in discovering it. It's extremely hard to do that without a theatrical run and or opportunities to kind of connect with audiences. So this is why it's important. I love that. I now will move into a streaming world that we will be able to actually connect with larger audiences. And I'm aware of the fact that that's where ultimately it will live on in its future. But for the moment, anyway, I'm proud of the fact that we made a concerted effort to kind of get out to theaters.
So Raphael Sbarge is my guest. The film is called Only in Theaters. I commend it to everyone watching all around the world. And I thank you very much. And I should say, too, we've linked all of UC Berling's recordings on the Adagio catalog to this particular show page. Raphael, thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the time, Fred. I so appreciate our conversation.